Hello everyone, so today we're going to be having a look at symbols in Romeo and Juliet, as well as thinking about how we can analyse in more depth and thinking about, in particular looking at certain physical tokens and symbols in Romeo and Juliet and how we can apply some literal and symbolic analysis to that. Okay, so to start off with then, something that I often get my people to think about is the idea of icebergs and how we can relate icebergs to analysis in literature. Okay, so this analogy I often use because, usually when we look at an extract, we look at the word, actually we're only just looking at, kind of the tip of the iceberg. So if I was to look at, in Jane Eyre, for example, the use of birds, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I've actually got to go in depth to really think about the idea of the symbol of birds and the importance of birds in that. And so there's that hidden depth to it that I really want to explore today. So one way that I kind of talk about this is through iceberg analysis that I'm going to show you at the end of the video for you to have a go at. At the surface level, there's these literal meanings. Underneath that, there's these hidden depths, these implicit meanings. But above the surface is explicit. Okay, so sometimes I'll have students that will pick out a quote from Romeo and Juliet, and they'll say, "This shows that Romeo really loves Juliet." Okay, great. That's the literal meaning. That's literally what's happening in the text, which is fine to do, but we then need to go one step further and think, what else is the language telling us? What's beneath the surface? What's the writer hinting at? Why did they pick that word over any other word? What's the authorial intention behind it? What's their language alluding to? What can we infer? Okay. So as an example then, this is taken from an Inspector Courses iceberg analysis is. So you can see here that, at surface level, the play is about a family that have all done terrible things to one character, but the play symbolises the struggle of the lower classes in a system built for those with money. It symbolises how we have a collective responsibility for each other as our lives are irrevocably intertwined. Okay, so I often say to my pupils that you want to have those sentence starters as literally this means, but symbolically this represents. So just think symbolically kind of is when we're thinking about those clever ideas in literature. It helps provide your concepts, which we're going to talk about in a little while. Okay, so to do this, we're going to talk about symbols quickly. A symbol is a use of a concrete object used to represent an abstract idea. So, for example, the symbol of the serpent is often used to represent, evil and the devil, and makes us think back to Genesis, the Garden of Eden, for example. However, it doesn't have to be things that that are biblical. Symbols can also be things like, if there's a poem about school railings, it might symbolically represent the oppressive feelings within schools. If there's a prison-like atmosphere, for example. But again, this is just symbolically. We don't have to read into it as this, because the literal true meaning is that these railings are just there designed to keep the children in, the public out. Symbolically is where we come up with these clever interpretations. In Inspector Calls, for example, there's the use of the engagement ring, and literally it just represents that two people are gonna, have a contract of marriage. But symbolically, a ring is, it forms a circle. It's meant to be this representation of eternal love, but it also might show that woman has been, almost been taken or owned by the man who doesn't wear a wedding ring until they're married. Just a bit of a gender debate there for you as well. Okay, so that's where we're going to get our clever perceptive ideas in, by using the sentence starter of symbolically. It could be said that this quote means or shows. Symbolism is indefinite. It's important to say it's just your interpretation. Another one would be the disinfectant in Inspector Calls. Okay, but now I want to look at symbols in Romeo and Juliet. I'm not going to take too long on each one, because the idea is that you go and do some more research based off of this. But I just want to kind of introduce some of them. So for me, letters, daggers, bottles of poison, birds, sun, moon, and stars are all concrete physical objects. And so they are different to themes, because a theme is an overarching idea, but symbols often help bring these themes to life, and give them a sense of kind of, of permanence, and kind of give them a tangible state. So the dagger, for example, can help add to that theme of hatred, or revenge, for example. Okay, so if I were you, on each slide that comes by, what I would do is I would go and have a go at, exploring literal and symbolic meanings. I'm just kind of, again, I'm almost just looking at the tip of the iceberg. It's up to you to go and do more analysis on this. So, literally, letters are used to transport information. A quote given is, "The letter was not nice but full of charge." So it was really important, that letter not getting to Romeo about Juliet's, fake death. Arguably is the true tragedy of the play, because it leads to Romeo killing himself, which leads to Juliet killing herself, giving a very happy ending to this tragedy. So in essence, we want to think about that real symbolic importance of the letter, which I often think is very much overlooked. And think about the way in which the characters communicate, and the way in which wires can be crossed. So letters are actually a really interesting thing to have a look at, I believe, in Romeo and Juliet. Definitely something worth going and doing more investigation on. And as I said here, symbolically, it arguably represents the downfall of Romeo, and it stresses that importance of miscommunication and bad timing. All the time thinking about what themes could this relate to, again, love, hatred, suicide, all of these things can be related back to the letter. Okay, so for each one I'm going to put a quote in. So again, I'm going to find a quote yourself, and then there'll be some little bits of information as well that I'll talk through. "Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rust and let me die." So she's literally becoming the case, the sheath for the dagger in which to lie in, because she's killing herself. Okay, so literally daggers are used for characters to injure each other or themselves, but symbolically represents the immediacy of death. One stab and a character is dead. It's also a physical symbol of the aggression, of the hatred in the text. It also represents freedom for Juliet, and I'm sure there's definitely a lot of stuff you can have a look at with toxic masculinity as well with the daggers, and they're these kind of like physical representations of their toxic masculinity. Again, there's a lot to unpack there. Clearly, I quite I like to talk about kind of like the gender aspect of it as well, because it's just so easy to have a look at the symbolism within it. As I said, that's what they literally form. So here we've got the idea of the rose. So if we think about where she says, one of the most famous lines out of all of Shakespeare's plays, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Literally, a rose is the rose is this metaphor used by Juliet to logically explain her feelings for Romeo. And flowers are talked about multiple times throughout the text. "This love will prove a beauteous flower when we next meet." I'm sure I've misquoted it there. But we want to think, why a rose? Why flowers? Why has he picked flowers? All the time we're questioning, why has the author done this? What else could they have done? I often say that by looking at what the author didn't do, it allows us to really unpack what the author did do. Symbolically, roses are very romantic flowers, but also very fragile and quite dangerous as well, because of the thorns on them can represent that hidden danger. Juliet talks about this because she says, if a rose was called a cabbage, it would still smell like a rose. But we want to think about why a rose, and that symbolic meaning there is, there's some of the ideas, to unpack that. So if we were looking at the character of Juliet, we might talk about how this almost foreshadows this idea of the rose, something that blooms but not for very long, something that has thorns on it. All the time we think about, how can we get this back into the exam, and that's kind of up to you from this to go and work out, actually, how would I get this into an essay plan. Okay then, so we've got the poison. I just want to make a note here. It says, "Come cordial and not poison, go with me to Juliet's grave, for there I must use thee." It's actually he's being quite clever here, Romeo is, because just before this, preceding this, he's at the apothecary, and he's getting the poison from the apothecary, and they argue about that this isn't real poison. He says this is cordial, so just like juice, because the real, he talks about the real poison in this world. He talks about, talk about, how money corrupts people, and you talk about the corruption in the world. And so for him, he doesn't see the poison as actual poison. But symbolically, it's this physical manifestation of Romeo's grief, suffering, and heartache. It represents that he feels he cannot go on, which this poison really represents. Okay. Right then, another one that someone else actually pointed out to me. I hadn't really thought that much about it, but there is the really important symbol of birds in Romeo and Juliet, and there's an interesting part of Romeo and Juliet, where this comes from. I were thy bird. This takes place after Romeo and Juliet spent the night together for the first time after their wedding, and there's a really weird quote that I find hilarious, where Juliet basically says that she wants that if Romeo was her bird, she'd love him so much she'd pet him to death, which I just think is like the best compliment ever. So if we want to think about this, literally these birds represent when they talk about the birds in this scene, it's morning. Romeo needs to leave, and Juliet wants him to be like a pet bird and stay near to her. But symbolically, birds are used across the text to represent fragility, vulnerability, and freedom, a freedom to love one another that Romeo and Juliet will never have, because it's a tragedy and they both die. Okay then, so celestial objects are super important in Romeo and Juliet. Celestial objects being anything in the sky, so like the stars, the sun, and the moon, and it gives this kind of greater kind of universal importance to their love, this kind of seismic importance. And there's several references to the sun and the moon, and to Romeo calling Juliet the sun, with the idea of light represented like knowledge and beauty. And so here, literally, Shakespeare uses this metaphor, rise fair sun and kill the envious moon, in the famous balcony scene, to show how beautiful Juliet is. But symbolically, it kind of represents, there's kind of two things here. It represents just how hyperbolic and over the top Romeo is. This is kind of a really clear representation of that. But it also symbolizes how she's being compared to celestial objects, and she's seen as greater than them, as well as symbolizing Romeo's quite over dramatic nature. I think this is quite an interesting line to look at for that. I think there's kind of less depth to it than other quotes that we've had a look at, but it's definitely an interesting one to have a look at due to the importance of the celestial imagery. And that moves us on to the stars, which is, I'd say, the most kind of analysed symbol in the text, because of how important they believed, they being the Elizabethan audience, believed stars were at the time. They were seen as representing the future for Shakespeare's audience. But symbolically, Shakespeare wants to show that it was the people's choices and their free will that determined their fate, not the stars. So in using stars, bear with. Okay, and we're back. So basically then, we want to think about how Shakespeare, in a way, wanted to reduce the importance of stars, and really think about the fact that it was, Romeo and Juliet's choices, as well as the choices of their family, that determine their fate. But it is always an interesting one to have a look at these ideas, these star-crossed lovers, and think about why Shakespeare described them as that. So that's something you probably want to have another look into, because stars are such an easy way of exploring the theme of fate, which you never know whether it might come up or not. Okay, so to have a quick look at the mark scheme then. Let's have a think about how looking at literal and symbolic meanings help us increase our mark in the exam. Just take a minute, pause the video, and have a think about, especially looking at so level 6, have a look at the rubric, we call it the wording of the mark scheme for AO1, 2 and 3, and really think about why might looking at these literal and symbolic meanings increase our mark. So hit pause. Okay, then just glad my phone hasn't gone off. So then basically, you want to think about, in particular, the words critical, exploratory, and conceptualize. That's so difficult for students to understand without it kind of being explained. So critical means because you are all literary critics, you are kind of judging what's in the text and, analysing it, dissecting it, taking it apart, giving your own critical opinion on it and as to why, what the author means, why they've done that, whether you agree or disagree. Exploratory, you know, really going into depth with it. And conceptualize is my favorite one, is coming up with a clever idea, clever concept, a driving force behind the essay. So for example, I wrote a thesis statement for an essay based on Romeo, and I talk about him as being the villain of the text. And so that was my concept. That's what I was kind of going with for the entire essay, the idea that Romeo is actually the villain, and kind of slating him a little bit, and that was my conceptualized response. We've also got interpretations there, so obviously that helps, you know, with our symbolic meanings there. And then we also want to think about how the writer uses methods to create meanings. Those meanings are what we're looking at when we look at symbolic meanings. Okay, because at lower parts of the band, so when we're literally explaining it, to get to clear, we can literally explain it, but you know, really to get to thoughtful and to get to perceptive, we need to look at the you know, the deeper meanings, hidden depths, as we said, full circle to go back to what we looked at, you know, with that iceberg. So what I want you to do now is have a go at picking at any of the quotes that I've looked at, or any of the quotes that you can find in the text, and it can be any text, it doesn't have to be Romeo and Juliet, and then have a go at thinking, number one, what's the literal meaning of this quote? Number two, are there any AO2 language techniques that you can spot, structural techniques, anything to do with your individual words that you can spot, lexical choices? Number three, the symbolic meaning of the quote. So literally and symbolically, what does this quote mean as an iceberg? Number four, what themes does it relate to? And number five, what contextual information does this relate to? Okay, so then hopefully you get to the point where you're able to incorporate this into your essays. And you know, I sometimes set it out like this. I have a question, I think about the buzzwords in the question, the quotes I've chosen, think of literal meaning, symbolic meaning, how am I going to discuss that in an individual paragraph. So the more you do this kind of thing, the easier it is to start actually getting those perceptive, you know, that perceptive analysis into your essays. And it's such an easy way to do it is by looking at literal and symbolic meanings. Okay, I hope that was helpful.